My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 69 years old, and my hands, though now wrinkled and spotted with age, still know the precise and gentle art of comfort. For 40 years, I was a pediatric nurse. My world was one of tiny, fragile bodies, of the sterile, hopeful scent of a neonatal intensive care unit, of the quiet, heroic hum of machines that breathed for those who could not yet breathe for themselves. I spoke the language of solace, a language of soft murmurs, of a steady, calming touch, of the infinite, unshakable patience required to soothe a frightened child or a terrified new mother. I believed, with the core of my being, that the greatest and most sacred duty in the world was to care for the helpless, to be a shield against the world's sharp edges. My late husband, Michael, was a man who understood this. He was a high school principal, a man who dedicated his life to shepherding teenagers through the chaotic, beautiful, and often painful journey of growing up. Our life together was a quiet partnership of care. We lived in a small, sturdy brick house, the one we bought with our wedding money, and we filled it with books, with the smell of my baking, and with the sound of our daughter, Jessica's, laughter. We were not wealthy, but we were rich in the things that mattered. A deep, abiding love for each other, a shared sense of purpose, and the beautiful, all-consuming project of raising our only child. My great sacrifice, the long, slow, and almost total liquidation of my own life, began, as these things so often do, with a death and a birth. Michael passed away from a sudden, aggressive cancer, leaving me a widow at 60. The silence in our brick house, once so full of his gentle, rumbling voice, became a deafening and deeply lonely roar. Just 6 months later, my daughter Jessica gave birth to her first child, a beautiful baby boy named Leo Dottie. Jessica and her husband Tom were not prepared for parenthood. They were not prepared for life. They were two people who had floated through their 20s on a cloud of youthful optimism and a series of low-paying, creative jobs. The sudden, brutal, and beautiful reality of a helpless new life, a life that was completely dependent on them, shattered their world. They were drowning in debt, in exhaustion, in the sheer, overwhelming terror of their own inadequacy. And so, I, the caregiver, the nurse, the mother, did what I had always done. I stepped in to save them. I sold my house, the brick fortress that held the entire, beautiful, and now finished story of my life with Michael. The sale brought in a considerable sum, the sum total of our 40 years of careful, frugal living, died. I did not put it in a trust. I did not invest it for my own future. I gave it to them. All of it. Pay off your debts, I'd said, the words a balm on their raw, panicked nerves. Find a bigger place, a place with a yard for Leo. This is your foundation, your fresh start. The plan was for me to move in with them. It's perfect, Mom, Jessica had said, her eyes shining with a tearful, grateful relief that I now know was a lie. We need you. I can't do this without you. We'll be a family. We'll take care of you. They bought a beautiful house in a good school district, a house far nicer than the one I had sold. And I, with my 2 suitcases and a single framed photograph of Michael, moved in. I was not given a bedroom. The spare room was Tom's home office. My new home was a small, airless den in the basement, a room that had been designed to store old furniture. My life, once my own, became a borrowed, subterranean existence. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, head nurse, homeowner, wife. I was Grandma, a title that was not a term of endearment, but a job description. I became their unpaid, 24/7, live-in nanny. I raised their son, Leo, and then, 2 years later, their daughter, Mia. I cooked. I cleaned. I did the laundry. I managed the household, my nurse's training in efficiency and order now applied to the chaotic and deeply dysfunctional system of their lives. I did it because I loved my grandchildren. I did it because I loved my daughter, and I could not bear to watch her fail. I was the silent, invisible, and utterly essential engine that kept their beautiful, new, and financially overextended lives running. I was the shield. I was the caregiver. And in the silence of my basement room, in the long, lonely hours after the children were asleep, I told myself that my sacrifice was a form of love. I did not realize that to them, I was not a gift. I was a utility, and my only value was in my usefulness. The humiliation was a slow, creeping, and deeply personal poison administered in the small, daily interactions of our shared and deeply unequal life. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, each one a small and seemingly insignificant wound that, over the years, bled me dry of my own sense of self-worth. It was in the way Jessica, my daughter, began to speak to me. The grateful, loving daughter was slowly, and then completely, replaced by a new persona, the harried, impatient, and deeply resentful boss of an incompetent and slightly stupid employee. My every action was subject to her criticism, her sighs of exasperation, her condescending corrections. "Not like that, Mother," she would snap, as I tried to fold the laundry in the way I had for 50 years. "The creases have to be perfect. Did you really give Leo a nut or cookie? We're trying to watch his sugar. The chicken was a little dry tonight, don't you think?" I, who had managed the care of critically ill children, who had held the hands of dying infants and their grieving parents, was now being micromanaged in the art of making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Tom, my son-in-law, was a silent, and therefore complicit, bystander. He was a weak, quiet man who was terrified of his wife's moods. He would simply retreat to his home office, the door closing with a soft, final click, leaving me alone to face her daily, low-grade, emotional barrage. He was a ghost in his own home, a man who had abdicated all responsibility in exchange for a quiet life. I endured it. I endured it for the grandchildren. They were my world, the only source of pure, uncomplicated joy in my shrinking, graying life. I was their sanctuary, their soft place to land in the tense, unpredictable emotional landscape of their own home. It was for them that I absorbed their mother's rages, that I bit back my own words, that I allowed myself to be slowly, methodically, and completely erased. The final, public, and unforgivable act of my own erasure, the one that finally and irrevocably shattered the last thin and brittle shell of my self-denial, happened on a Saturday afternoon. It was a day like any other, a day of quiet, simmering tension. The catalyst was a glass of spilled milk. Little Mia, who was just 3, had been reaching for a crayon at the kitchen table. Her small, clumsy elbow had knocked over her glass. A river of white, milky liquid cascaded onto the floor. It was a small, normal, and utterly insignificant childhood accident. But to Jessica, it was a personal affront. It was the final, unbearable straw in a life of disappointments she could not, or would not, acknowledge as her own. Her reaction was not one of annoyance. It was a storm, a hurricane of pure, undiluted, and terrifying rage. She did not yell at her daughter. She turned on me. "This is your fault," she shrieked, her voice a high, piercing, and ugly sound. "You're supposed to be watching her. What do I even have you here for, if you can't do one simple thing, right?" The children, Leo and Mia, froze, their faces a mask of a terror that was all too familiar. They ran to me, their small bodies pressing against my legs, seeking shelter from their own mother's storm. I knelt. I wrapped my arms around them. "It's all right, my darlings," I whispered, my voice a low, calming murmur. "It was an accident. We'll clean it up." My act of comforting my own grandchildren, of shielding them from her rage, seemed to be the thing that pushed her over the edge. She saw their love for me as a betrayal. She advanced on us. Her face was a twisted, ugly mask of a resentment so profound, so deep, that it seemed to have been festering for years. "You!" she spat, her voice now a low, venomous hiss. She was not speaking to the children. She was speaking to me. "You are the accident, you and your sad, old, and pathetic life. You are the spilled milk in my house. You are the reason my life is not what it is supposed to be. You are the reason I am stuck and tired and miserable." I looked up at her, at my daughter, the baby I had held in my arms, the girl whose every tear I had kissed away. And I saw a stranger, a cruel and deeply unhappy stranger. And then she said the words, the final and fatal words. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the front door. "I want you out," she screamed, her voice now a raw, ragged thing, the sound of a soul tearing itself apart. "I want you out of my house, out of my life. You and your sad, old, and useless memories. Get out, now. Get out. I will call them. There is a crazy old woman in my house who refuses to leave. Get out. Get out, or I'll call the cops." The words, the threat, the final, absolute, and brutal severance. She was not just throwing me out. She was threatening to have me arrested, to have me publicly and officially branded as an intruder, a trespasser, in the very house I had paid for, in the very family I had spent my life trying to save. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not argue. In that moment, the nurse, the caregiver, the loving and endlessly self-sacrificing mother finally and completely died. She had been evicted, and in her place, a new woman was born. A woman who was calm, a woman who was cold, and a woman who had, for the first time in a decade, been given a gift. The gift of a new and beautifully, brutally clear sense of purpose. I stood up. I gently disentangled myself from my weeping grandchildren. I looked at my daughter, at the stranger who was wearing her face, and I spoke. "All right, Jessica," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a head nurse, a voice of calm and quiet and absolute authority. "If that is what you want." And I turned, and I left. I walked out of the house I had bought, out of the life I had built for them, and I did not look back. I had my handbag with my wallet and my phone. And I had a story, a long and meticulously documented story of service, of sacrifice, and of a debt that was, I had just decided, long, long overdue for collection. I walked out of that house into the cold, gray light of a late Saturday afternoon. I did not have a destination. I was a ghost, a refugee, a woman with a handbag and a broken heart, and I was, for the first time in my life, utterly and completely homeless. The world, the familiar, suburban landscape of my own neighborhood, seemed alien, hostile. The manicured lawns, the quiet, respectable houses, they were a part of a life I was no longer a member of. I walked. I just walked, my sensible shoes making a soft, rhythmic, and aimless sound on the pavement. I walked for hours as the afternoon sun faded and a cold, damp chill began to creep into the air. I was in a state of shock, a walking, breathing embodiment of a life that had just been canceled. The cruelty of my daughter's words, the finality of that slammed door, replayed in my mind in a continuous tormenting loop. "Get out, or I'll call the cops." See, she had not just thrown me out. She had threatened me with the ultimate humiliation, to be branded a criminal, a trespasser, in the very life I had created. As darkness fell, a cold, drizzling rain began to fall. I was tired. My bones ached with a weariness that was not just physical, but existential. I had nowhere to go. My friends, the few I had left, were scattered, and I was too ashamed, too broken to call them, to try to explain the inexplicable, sordid reality of my situation. And so, I found myself, almost without thinking, standing on the doorstep of the one house in the neighborhood that had always been a quiet and unobtrusive presence, the house next door. It was a small, neat, and unassuming brick house, much like the one I had sold. It was the home of Mr. Alistair Finch, a retired corporate lawyer, a widower, a man I had known, in the quiet, neighborly way of suburban life, for over 20 years. We were not friends, not in the intimate sense. We were simply neighbors. We had exchanged polite pleasantries over the hedge. We had brought in each other's mail when one of us was away. He was a quiet, reserved, and deeply intelligent man, with eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. I stood there on his doorstep, the rain plastering my gray hair to my head, a pathetic and drowning old woman. I do not know what I would have said. I do not know what I was asking for. But I had nowhere else to go. And so, I rang the bell. He opened the door. He was holding a book, a finger marking his place. He looked at me, standing on his porch in the rain, and his calm, intelligent face did not register surprise. It registered a kind of quiet and weary recognition, as if he were a man who had been expecting a storm, and it had finally and inevitably arrived on his doorstep. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, calm, and deeply reassuring rumble. "My God, please, come in." And in the warm, dry, and book-lined safety of his living room, for the first time that day, I fell apart. The stoic, competent head nurse, the woman who had held it together for so long, simply disintegrated. And I wept. I wept for my dead husband. I wept for my lost home. I wept for my monstrous, ungrateful daughter. And I wept for the foolish, loving, and utterly broken woman I had become. He did not interrupt. He did not offer platitudes. He simply made me a cup of hot, sweet tea, and he listened. He listened with the patient, focused, and deeply analytical attention of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to testimony. I told him everything. The sold house, the basement den, the years of quiet, creeping abuse, the spilled milk, and the final, brutal threat. When I was done, a spent and empty husk of a woman, he was silent for a long moment. He looked not at me, but into the middle distance, as if he were reviewing a complex legal brief in his mind. "I have seen you, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice quiet, but with a new and unfamiliar hardness. "For the past 10 years, from my window, I have seen you. I saw you teaching your grandson to ride a bike when his own father was too busy. I saw you in the garden with your granddaughter, for hours, in the hot sun. I have heard," he said, his eyes now meeting mine, "and in them I saw a flicker of a cold and righteous anger, the way your daughter speaks to you when she thinks no one is listening. A corporate lawyer, my dear, He stood up and began to pace his small, neat living room. He was no longer a quiet, retired neighbor. He was a lawyer, a lion, a man who had just been presented with a case that had offended his deepest and most fundamental sense of justice. "This is not a family drama, Eleanor," he said, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. "This is a crime. Not a crime of violence, not in the legal sense, but it is a crime of a different, and perhaps more insidious nature. It is a crime of unjust enrichment, of the fraudulent conversion of assets, of a decade of uncompensated labor, extracted under conditions of emotional duress." I stared at him, bewildered. He was speaking a language I did not understand. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He stopped pacing. He turned to me, and his eyes were shining with the cold, beautiful, and terrifying light of a legal mind that has just found a new and very worthy cause. "I mean," he said, "that the law, in its beautiful and often clumsy way, has a remedy for this. She did not just take your love, your service for granted. She took your money, your house, your labor. Those are tangible assets, Eleanor. They have a value, and we are going to present her with a bill. And we are going to present her with a bill." My mind, the mind of a nurse, could not comprehend. "A bill? An invoice," he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "For your life, for the past 10 years of your life, and I, my dear Eleanor, am going to come out of my very pleasant and very boring retirement, and I am going to be your lawyer. Pro bono, of course. It will be the single greatest pleasure of my entire and very long legal career." My old life ended on that rainy Saturday, in the tears and the wreckage of my own broken heart. My new life began the following Monday morning, in the quiet, sunlit, and deeply logical sanctuary of Alistair Finch's home office. The plan he devised was not a messy, emotional custody battle or a bitter, she said divorce proceeding. It was a masterpiece of cold, corporate, and beautifully brutal, legal and financial logic. It was not a lawsuit for pain and suffering. It was a lawsuit for the recovery of assets and the compensation for services rendered. It was a lawsuit that transformed me, in the eyes of the law, from a burden into a creditor. A major and deeply aggrieved creditor. Our first step was not to file a lawsuit. It was to build a case. An airtight, irrefutable, and utterly devastating case. Alistair, it turned out, had not just been a casual observer. He was a lawyer, and a lawyer, like a nurse, is a trained and meticulous note-taker. He had, over the years, kept a quiet, private log of the things he had seen and heard. The dates, the times, the specific, cruel words he had overheard Jessica scream at me from across the lawn. His journal became Exhibit A. Our second step was to quantify my sacrifice. Alistair hired a forensic accountant, a sharp, unsentimental woman who specialized in valuing the unvalued. And for the next month, I did not grieve. I worked. I became the star witness in the case of my own life. I sat with the accountant for hours each day, and we went through my life, year by year, transaction by transaction. We calculated the exact after-tax amount from the sale of my home that I had given them. We calculated the thousands of dollars of my own, modest pension that I had spent on their groceries, their utilities, their children's clothes, their vacations. And then we did the most radical and the most beautiful thing of all. We calculated the market value of my labor. We were not emotional. We were professionals. A full-time live-in, pediatric nurse and childcare provider, with my 40 years of experience. We found the highest, top of the market, agency rate. We calculated it for 10 years, at 60 hours a week, a conservative estimate. We added in overtime. We added in holiday pay. We added in the cost of benefits, of health insurance, of a pension plan that I had been denied. The final number, the final, beautiful, and irrefutable invoice for my life was a thing of pure, breathtaking, and deeply satisfying shock. It was a number so large, so solid, so undeniable that it made me weep. Not with sadness, but with a sense of a profound and long overdue validation. My life, my work, my sacrifice, it had a value. And it was a value they could never, ever hope to repay. The lawsuit was filed on a quiet Tuesday morning. It was not served by a scary-looking process server. It was delivered by a quiet, professional, and deeply unimpressed courier. The lawsuit did not demand the house. It did not demand an apology. It simply and quietly demanded payment. Full payment, with interest. It was a declaration of war, fought not with the messy, unpredictable weapons of emotion, but with the cold, hard, and unforgiving steel of mathematics. The phone call came that evening. It was not Jessica. It was Tom, her husband, the silent partner, the ghost. His voice was a strangled, terrified whisper. "Eleanor," he stammered. We got a letter. From a lawyer. This has to be a mistake. The numbers are insane. We don't have this kind of money. Nobody has this kind of money. It is not a mistake, Tom, I said, and my voice, the voice he had so rarely heard, was calm and quiet and as solid as the judgment that was about to be entered against them. It is a bill for 10 years of service, and it is long, long overdue. They were trapped. Their beautiful house, the one I had paid for, was their only significant asset, and its value was not nearly enough to cover the debt they now, legally and irrefutably, owed me. They had not just lost their nanny. They had not just lost their mother. They had just inherited a creditor who had a perfect 10-year and utterly unforgiving record of every single transaction, and who was now, with the full and beautiful force of the law behind her, demanding to be paid in full. The lawsuit was a bomb that detonated not with a loud, fiery explosion, but with the quiet, suffocating implosion of a black hole. It did not create a dramatic, public spectacle. It created a slow, private, and deeply personal hell for Jessica and Tom, a hell constructed from the cold, inescapable logic of their own financial ruin. They tried to fight it, of course. They hired a lawyer, a man who, after seeing the mountain of evidence Alistair and I had compiled, the 10 years of receipts, the forensic accountant's report, Alistair's own notarized journal of observed abuse, quietly advised them that their only viable legal strategy was to beg for mercy. There was no trial. There was a series of quiet, brutal, and deeply satisfying settlement conferences in a sterile, gray-walled legal office. I did not attend. I had Alistair represent me. I had already given my testimony in the form of my meticulous records. I had no more words for them. I watched from a distance as their beautiful, carefully curated world was dismantled, piece by painful piece. The lawsuit, now a matter of public record, was a source of deep and delicious shame for them. Their friends, the ones for whom they had performed their life of effortless success, began to drift away. Their careers, the flimsy, self-styled ventures that had been funded by my life savings, collapsed. The final settlement was not a negotiation, it was a liquidation. Faced with a debt so massive, it would have followed them for the rest of their lives. They had only one choice. They had to sell the house. The beautiful 4-bedroom house in the good school district, the house that had been the stage for their perfect life, the house that had been the symbol of everything they had taken from me. I did not want the money. I had made that clear to Alistair. My lawsuit was not about profit. It was about principle. It was about the validation of a life's worth of service. And so, the terms of the settlement were simple and beautiful and deeply, deeply just. The proceeds from the sale of the house were to be placed in a trust. From that trust, a single final payment was to be made to me for the full and exact amount of my original documented financial investment, the money from the sale of my own blue brick house. Not a penny more. The rest of the money, the vast majority of it, the sum that represented the market value of my 10 years of uncompensated labor, my 10 years of servitude, was to be placed in a separate charitable trust, administered by Alistair and myself. They were not just losing their house. They were being forced, by the beautiful and unforgiving logic of the law, to take the monetary value of my pain, of my sacrifice, and to give it away to charity. They were left with nothing, not a penny of profit, only the ashes of the life they had built on my back. The last time I saw my daughter was the day they moved out. I did not go to the house. I simply sat on a bench in the park across the street, a quiet, anonymous old woman in a simple coat. I watched as a moving truck, much smaller than the one that had moved them in, was loaded with the remnants of their life. I watched as they got into their old beaten-up car, their faces pale and drawn and aged. And I watched as they drove away, out of the neighborhood, out of the life they had stolen, and out of my own. I did not feel hatred. I did not feel triumph. I felt only a profound and deeply weary sense of peace. The fever had broken. The patient was, finally and completely, cured. My old life ended that day on a park bench with the quiet, final departure of my own lost child. My new life began the next morning with a phone call to a real estate agent. I did not buy a grand house. I did not need one. I bought a small, beautiful, and light-filled condominium on the top floor of a quiet building, with a balcony that overlooked a children's playground. And I began, for the first time in a decade, to build a life that was entirely and completely my own. The money, the vast sum that was the legal quantification of my pain, became the engine of my new purpose. The charitable trust, which Alistair and I had created, was given a name. It is called the Eleanor Foundation for New Families. My work, my life's work, had always been about care, about nurturing, about providing a safe and steady hand for those at the very beginning of their journey. And I realized, in the quiet, peaceful days of my new life, that my work was not yet done. The Eleanor Foundation does one simple and beautiful thing. We provide grants to new and struggling parents. We are a private and much more personal safety net. We help pay for childcare. We help cover the rent for a month when a new baby arrives. We provide funding for visiting nurses, for lactation consultants, for the small and often overwhelming things that can make the difference between a family that thrives and a family that, like my own daughters, begins to drown. My life now is quiet, but it is not empty. It is filled with a new kind of purpose. I am no longer a caregiver to one ungrateful family. I am a benefactor to hundreds of new and grateful ones. My apartment is filled not with the silence of loneliness, but with the happy, chaotic, and beautiful sound of a life that is, once again, connected to the world. My dear neighbor, Alistair, is now my dearest friend. He is the co-administrator of the foundation, and our weekly board meetings are the highlight of my week, a meeting of two old and quiet souls who found in the wreckage of their own separate griefs a shared and deeply satisfying purpose. This evening, I am sitting on my balcony, a cup of tea in my hand. The air is filled with the sound of children's laughter from the playground below. On the table beside me is a stack of letters, of photographs. They are from the families my foundation has helped. A picture of a smiling baby in a new, safe crib. A letter from a young, single mother, a nurse, who, because of our grant, was able to take an extra month of maternity leave to be with her child. I read the letters and I feel a sense of peace, a sense of rightness that my own biological family never gave me. I spent a decade of my life as a prisoner, a servant, in a house that was supposed to be a home. I learned, in the crucible of my own, profound and deeply painful betrayal, that a family is not an obligation. It is a choice. It is a verb. It is something you build every day with acts of kindness, of respect, and of a love that is not a transaction, but a gift, freely and gratefully given. My daughter screamed at me to get out of her house, and in doing so, she gave me the greatest gift of my life. She gave me back my own. She forced me to leave a house that was a prison, and in doing so, she opened the door to the entire, beautiful, and waiting world. And for that, in the quietest, most private corner of my own, healed, and finally free heart, I am, in a strange and deeply ironic way, grateful.